Before getting into today's stories, let me know where everyone is from and what time so we can send wishes of health and luck to you and your relatives and friends. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos of our channel. Thank you very much, everyone. Let's get started. Story 1. In October of 2023, Alex and Natalie met a seemingly friendly couple, Ethan and Rachel, during a local hiking group meetup. The couple quickly extended an invitation to join them for a weekend trip at Pine Hollow Reserve, a secluded spot known for its dense woods and tranquil lakes. Alex and Natalie, avid hikers themselves, decided to accept, but planned to only visit for the evening rather than stay overnight. The reserve was a mere hour's drive from their home, so they thought a brief trip would be harmless. They arrived around 4 p.m. carrying snacks, a cooler of drinks, and plenty of water. Ethan and Rachel had set up their campsite near the forest edge, where the towering pines blocked most of the sunlight. The group relaxed by the fire, sharing stories and enjoying lighthearted banter. Natalie noticed that Ethan and Rachel seemed oddly quiet at times, exchanging subtle glances as if silently communicating. She brushed it off, attributing it to their close relationship. As night fell, Ethan suggested they take a walk to the nearby lake. It was a short trek, he assured them, less than a mile through the woods. The group grabbed flashlights, though Ethan insisted the moonlight would guide them well enough. Alex and Natalie followed, feeling a growing unease they couldn't quite place. As they walked, the woods seemed to close in around them. The air grew colder, and the chirping of crickets faded into an eerie silence. Natalie checked her phone. 8:15 p.m. She slipped it back into her pocket, determined to stay composed. Suddenly, Ethan stopped and pointed to a faint light through the trees, claiming it was the lake's reflection. But before they reached it, everything went black. Alex awoke on damp moss, his body aching and his head pounding. The faint smell of decay lingered in the air. He groaned and turned to find Natalie sprawled beside him, pale and shivering. "Natalie, wake up," he whispered hoarsely, shaking her shoulder. She stirred, blinking at him in confusion. "What happened?" she murmured. They were no longer near the lake or the campsite. Instead, they found themselves deep in the forest, surrounded by gnarled trees that seemed to loom over them menacingly. Their flashlights were gone, and the moonlight barely penetrated the canopy above. "Where are Ethan and Rachel?" Alex asked, his voice trembling. Natalie shook her head, trying to suppress the rising panic. "We need to get back to the campsite," she said firmly. They began to walk, relying on the faint starlight to guide their way. As they trudged through the underbrush, Natalie felt a prickling sensation, as if they were being watched. She grabbed Alex's arm. "Do you feel that?" she whispered. He nodded grimly, his eyes scanning the shadows. The woods seemed to breathe, each rustle of leaves and snap of a twig sending chills down their spines. "It feels like someone's following us," Alex muttered, his voice low and tense. Natalie tightened her grip on his arm. "Do you think it's them?" she asked, glancing over her shoulder. Before Alex could answer, a branch snapped behind them. They both froze, their breath hitching in their throats. "Ethan!" Alex called out hesitantly, his voice barely above a whisper. No response came. Instead, the silence deepened, oppressive and suffocating. "We need to keep moving," Natalie urged, pulling him forward. The path ahead seemed endless, the trees closing in like walls. Their steps quickened, but the feeling of being watched persisted, growing heavier with each passing moment. "Wait," Alex said suddenly, stopping in his tracks. He turned to face Natalie, his eyes wide with fear. "Do you hear that?" he asked. She listened intently, and a faint guttural sound reached her ears, distant but unmistakable. It was neither animal nor human, a chilling noise that sent shivers down her spine. "We need to go now," she said urgently, her voice shaking. They broke into a run, their breaths ragged and hearts pounding. The sound grew louder, closer, a low growl mixed with a distorted whisper that seemed to echo all around them. "Alex!" Natalie cried, stumbling over a root. He caught her arm, pulling her upright. "Keep going," he urged, his own fear barely contained. Eventually, they reached a clearing. In the center stood a dilapidated cabin, its windows shattered and its door hanging ajar. Alex hesitated. "Maybe we can find something to help us," he suggested. Reluctantly, Natalie agreed. Inside, the air was thick with mildew. Dust-covered furniture and broken glass littered the floor. On the wall hung a map of the reserve, but it was smeared with something dark and unrecognizable. A faint scratching sound echoed from somewhere deeper in the cabin. Natalie froze. "We should go," she whispered. Before Alex could respond, a guttural voice called out from the shadows, "You're not supposed to be here." They bolted, sprinting back into the woods, adrenaline overriding their exhaustion. The voice followed, distorted and echoing, growing louder with each step. Natalie tripped and fell, scraping her hands on the jagged rocks. Alex helped her up, urging her to keep moving. Eventually, they reached the campsite, but it was eerily deserted. The fire had burned out, and Ethan and Rachel's tent was gone. Alex checked his phone, 7 a.m. Somehow, nearly 11 hours had passed. Dazed and terrified, they drove home in silence. When they tried contacting Ethan and Rachel, their numbers were disconnected. The hiking group had no record of anyone by their names. Days later, Natalie received an anonymous email. It contained a photo of the cabin and a single message: "Don't come back." To this day, Alex and Natalie avoid Pine Hollow Reserve and refuse to discuss what happened that night. But sometimes, when Natalie dreams, she hears the voice again, whispering from the shadows of the forest, "You're not supposed to be here." Story 2. The snow had fallen heavily that evening, blanketing the camp in an eerie silence. I was a guide for a group of teens at a secluded Winter Scouts camp deep in the northern woods. The temperature had dropped sharply after sunset, and the only warmth came from the faint embers of a dying fire in the central pit. By 1 a.m., the camp was still, the only sounds being the occasional rustle of the wind through the trees. It was then that I felt a gentle nudge on my shoulder. One of the younger scouts, Daniel, stood at the entrance to my tent, his face pale in the dim moonlight. "I need to go," he murmured. It took me a moment to shake off my grogginess, but I nodded, zipping up my coat and stepping out with him into the freezing night. I waited a few feet away while Daniel hurried off to the designated bathroom area near the tree line. When he returned, his expression was different, his voice quieter than before. "There's someone by the fire," he said, almost too casually. I frowned. "Who's out there?" Daniel shrugged. "Some guy. He's just standing there staring at the fire. He's wearing a red coat." Alarm prickled at the back of my neck. I peered out of the tent window, scanning the area. The fire pit was faintly illuminated by the moon, but there was no one there. I reassured Daniel it was probably his imagination or a trick of the light, and we both returned to our tents. Sleep didn't come easily after that. An hour later, I found myself needing to step out into the cold for my own reasons. The camp remained deathly quiet, the air crisp and still. I shivered, pulling my scarf tighter as I moved. On my way back to the tent, a strange feeling washed over me. My gaze shifted instinctively toward the fire pit, and there he was. A man stood motionless, the glow of the moon casting long shadows behind him. He was tall, his broad frame clad in a red coat, its fabric faintly reflecting the light. His face was obscured by shadow, but I could feel his eyes on me, unblinking and fixed. My breath caught, and a surge of fear gripped me. I fumbled for the flashlight hanging on my belt. The beam flickered to life as I pointed it toward the fire pit. But the moment the light cut through the darkness, the man was gone. The fire pit was empty once more, and the shadows danced innocently, as if mocking me. I hurried back to my tent, my heart racing. I woke up Ryan, another guide, shaking his shoulder urgently. "There's someone out there," I hissed. Ryan groaned but sat up, rubbing his eyes. "What are you talking about?" "A man by the fire pit. He was staring at me." Ryan's face hardened at my tone. "Stay here. I'll check it out." "I'm coming with you," I insisted. Together, we scoured the camp, flashlights cutting through the snow-dusted ground. We checked every tent, every tree, every corner of the campsite. The snow was pristine, untouched by any footprints other than our own. Even the area around the fire pit was undisturbed, the powdery surface unmarred. Ryan sighed, shaking his head. "There's no one here." "I know what I saw," I muttered, my voice trembling. Ryan looked at me, his expression shifting. "Are you sure you're not just imagining things? It is late, and we're both exhausted." "I'm not imagining anything," I snapped. "He was there. I could see the red coat. The way he just stood there. He was watching me." Ryan's flashlight flickered as he swept it toward the tree line. He paused, his face paling. What if it's someone messing with us? Maybe a prank. In the middle of nowhere, I replied bitterly. Who would come all the way out here for that? Ryan hesitated, glancing at the fire pit again. Maybe it's one of the kids, he said, though his tone lacked conviction. I shook my head. The kids are asleep. I checked before I woke you up. We stood there for a moment, the silence stretching out, heavy and oppressive. Then a low melodic whistle broke the quiet. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it sent a chill racing down my spine. Ryan's grip on his flashlight tightened. Did you hear that? He whispered. I nodded, swallowing hard. The whistle came again, this time closer. It was hauntingly tuneful, like a lullaby warped and stretched. We both turned toward the sound, our breaths visible in the freezing air. The light from my flashlight caught something in the distance, a glint of red, barely visible through the trees. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. There, I whispered. Ryan followed my gaze, his flashlight trembling in his hand. Let's go back to the tents, he said quietly, his voice strained. We'll check everything again in the morning. Reluctantly, I nodded and we retreated to the campsite. As we approached the tents, the whistle came again, fainter now, as if mocking us. I didn't sleep that night, my mind replaying the image of the man in red and the eerie melody that seemed to follow us. By morning, the campers were none the wiser, their laughter and chatter breaking the tension of the previous night. But as we packed up, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Near the fire pit, partially covered by fresh snow, was a single red thread. It fluttered faintly in the breeze, as if daring me to question its presence. I said nothing, but even now the memory lingers. The man in the red coat haunts my thoughts, and I've never returned to that camp. I can still hear the whistle sometimes, faint and far away, as if carried on the winter wind. Story 3. It was a quiet summer evening, the kind where the air feels charged but still, carrying the faint smell of the river and the forest beyond. My family and I, my husband, my brother and I, decided to spend the night catfishing. We'd done this plenty of times before, setting up by the water, lighting a small fire, and settling in for a long, peaceful night. That night was no different, at least until it wasn't. The evening started uneventfully. We picked our spot just as dusk began to settle in, gathered firewood, and lit the fire. The sky was clear, the stars bright, and the river was calm. As the hours passed, our fishing yielded little more than a few perch. Around 1 a.m., we started discussing whether to pack up or stay a little longer. My husband and brother decided to check a few other spots downstream, leaving me by the fire. I lay back on the soft ground, enjoying the quiet. The fire crackled gently, and the rhythm of the river was soothing. But the tranquility broke when I heard my brother's voice calling out, low but firm, "Are those lights?" I sat up, following his gaze upstream. Across the river, past me, there were 3 small, glowing orbs of light. They were faint but distinct, moving in slow, deliberate patterns. I could feel my heart rate pick up. Flashlights, I thought, but something about them was off. They didn't beam or flicker like normal flashlights. Instead, they glowed steadily, bluish-white, like dim lanterns. "That's weird," my husband muttered, his voice uncertain. "Who'd be out there this late?" The lights moved unnaturally. They didn't bob or sway like someone walking along a bank. Instead, they glided, tracing smooth, looping patterns. One moved away from the group briefly, then rejoined. The others circled slowly, almost lazily. I stood up, moving closer to where my brother and husband stood. "Could it be someone messing with us?" my brother asked. His tone was skeptical but edged with unease. "Doesn't make sense," I replied. "Nobody had climbed that bank at night. It's too steep, too dense." The opposite riverbank was practically a cliff, covered in brush and mud. "What if it's kids playing a prank?" my husband suggested, though his voice lacked confidence. "No one else is supposed to be out here tonight." "Prank or not, those lights aren't moving like someone's walking," my brother said, narrowing his eyes at the orbs. "Look at how they're gliding. That's not normal." I could hear a faint tremor in his voice, and it unsettled me further. "We should stay together," I said quickly, hoping to quell the growing tension. "No," my husband said firmly, his eyes fixed on the lights. "We need to check this out. If it's someone, we should know. If it's something else, I'd rather not be caught off guard." Before I could protest, he and my brother grabbed their flashlights and started making their way downstream. I stayed behind, my eyes glued to the strange orbs. As they got closer, things took a turn. One of the lights suddenly blinked out, only to reappear moments later at the top of a tall pecan tree that had to be at least 15 feet high. The other two split up. One moved upstream, away from my husband and brother, while the other floated toward me, stopping just across the river. It hovered there, as if watching. My chest tightened, and I felt frozen in place. "What the hell is it doing up there?" My brother's voice carried faintly through the dark. "Did you see it move, or did it just appear?" "I don't know," my husband replied, his voice tense. "Keep your light on it." "We're almost there." As they rounded the bend in the river, the lights all blinked out in unison. My brother stopped dead in his tracks. "They're gone," he said, his voice barely audible. "Stay close," my husband said firmly. "They're here somewhere. Just keep looking." I could see their flashlight beams sweeping the far bank, cutting through the darkness. But the lights didn't reappear. The stillness was deafening. No rustling leaves, no snapping twigs, no splash of water. Just silence. It was as if the forest was holding its breath. "I don't like this," my brother said, his voice shaking. "We need to go." "Not yet," my husband replied, his gaze still fixed on the trees. "If we leave now, we'll never know what it was." "I'm not sure I want to know," my brother muttered. I gestured for them to come back, my voice shaking. "We need to leave." They hurried back, and we quickly packed up our gear. As we loaded the car, the forest seemed to close in around us, the shadows deeper, the air heavier. None of us spoke much on the drive home, but the unease lingered, thick and suffocating. In the daylight, we returned to the spot a few weeks later, trying to make sense of what we'd seen. We scaled the opposite bank to where the lights had been, but the terrain was impossible. The brush was too dense, the cliff too steep. There was no way anyone could have been there, not without leaving a trace. We've gone fishing at that spot many times since, but never at night. The river feels different after dark now, heavier somehow, as if the lights are still there, just out of sight. Sometimes when the stars are bright and the wind is still, I think I can see a faint glow through the trees, watching and waiting. We still don't talk about it much, but I know we all feel the same. Whatever those lights were, they weren't normal, they weren't human, and they're still out there. Story 4. The Appalachian Mountains have always carried an air of mystery, their winding trails often cloaked in fog and shadow. I was on a solo camping trip, relishing the solitude, the crisp night air, and the rhythmic crackle of my campfire. My first night near the Appalachian Scenic Trail was uneventful, and I found comfort in the serenity of the woods. But things began to change as the shadows deepened. It was late, my fire burning low, when a man emerged from the dark trees. His sudden appearance startled me. He had a wiry frame, his face shadowed by the flickering firelight. "Lost my way," he said, his voice even and calm. "Been wandering for hours?" He asked if he could rest at my camp until morning. His story seemed plausible, and though his arrival was unsettling, I nodded. Offering him a beer, I sat back, watching him closely as we exchanged small talk. His demeanor was friendly, his laughter easy, and by the time I fell asleep, the unease had dulled. When I woke, he was gone. The following night, I set up camp about 20 miles further along the trail. As the sky darkened, I was unpacking my gear when I heard footsteps. Turning, I froze. It was him again, the same man from the night before. "Small world," he said with a smile. I asked how he managed to cover so much ground. He shrugged, claiming he was an experienced hiker. His explanation was reasonable, but something about it gnawed at me. Still, we spent the evening much like before, and by morning, he had vanished again. As we sat by the fire that second night, I tried to steer the conversation toward his journey. "So, where are you headed?" I asked, keeping my tone casual. He paused, his gaze fixed on the flames. "Just following the trail, same as you," he said after a moment. "Funny we keep crossing paths," I said, forcing a chuckle. "These woods are vast." "They are," he replied, his voice low. "But sometimes paths have a way of converging." His words sent a chill down my spine, though I couldn't pinpoint why. I pressed on. "You must be covering serious ground to keep up like this." He tilted his head, the flickering firelight casting strange shadows on his face. "I'm not sure it's about distance," he said cryptically. "Sometimes it's about where you need to be." I tried to mask my unease, changing the subject. The trail has a way of making you feel small, I said, gesturing to the dark expanse of trees around us. Like you're part of something much bigger. He nodded slowly, his eyes unreadable. Bigger, yes, and sometimes something you don't fully understand. The conversation left me uneasy, his words lingering in my mind long after we fell into silence. I didn't sleep much that night, the crackling of the fire my only comfort. When I woke, he was gone again, as if he had never been there. The third night, I decided to camp off the beaten path, miles from the official trail. The unsettling feeling from the previous night lingered, and I chose a secluded spot far from where I thought he could find me. As a precaution, I parked my car out of sight and concealed my camp deep in the woods. Then I waited. The hours passed slowly, my senses heightened by the silence. Near midnight, headlights cut through the distant darkness. Hidden among the rocky outcrop overlooking the trail, I watched as a car pulled to a stop near where I had parked the night before. It was his car. My stomach turned as I pieced it together. He had been following me, using my parked car as a guide. I watched as he shouldered a pack and disappeared into the woods, likely searching for a camp that wasn't there. I wasted no time. Gathering my things quickly and silently, I retraced my steps back to my car, driving another 40 miles along the trail. This time I parked near a ranger station, ensuring witnesses should anything go wrong. I didn't sleep that night, bourbon in hand, eyes scanning the darkness. It was past midnight when I heard footsteps crunching through the underbrush. My heart sank as I saw him emerge from the trees, his expression unreadable. "We keep meeting," he said, his tone light but his eyes unsettlingly fixed on me. I forced a smile, staying cordial but tense, every muscle in my body on edge. "Funny how that happens," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "You must really love this trail." "It has its appeal," he said, taking a seat by the fire without invitation. "Something about the quiet." "The quiet can be deceiving," I said carefully, my grip tightening on the bottle in my hand. "Sometimes it hides things." He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Or reveals them," he said softly. I stayed awake, watching him carefully as he settled near the fire. When I finally dozed off, it was brief and restless. I woke suddenly to a chilling sensation, his hand brushing against my arm. My blood ran cold. He was leaning over me, his breath close. Adrenaline surged. I shoved him back. Springing to my feet, he stumbled, surprise flashing across his face. Grabbing my knife, I leveled it at him, my voice low and threatening. "Stay back!" He raised his hands, feigning innocence, but I saw the predatory glint in his eyes. When he lunged, I reacted instinctively, slashing toward him and landing a blow. He howled in pain, clutching his arm, but didn't retreat. It took everything I had to subdue him, pinning him to the ground with the blade at his throat. Tying him to a tree with my spare rope, I dismantled his campsite, slashing his tent and scattering his belongings. Before leaving, I smashed the windshield of his car, ensuring he wouldn't be following me anytime soon. I drove straight home, heart pounding the entire way. For days I stayed indoors, the paranoia creeping in every time I heard a creak or saw a shadow. I never returned to that stretch of trail, and I haven't camped alone since. The mountains may hold many mysteries, but I've learned some are better left unexplored. Story 5. The Green Mountains were silent. The kind of silence that wraps around you and makes every step feel loud. I'd been hiking solo for hours, my gear heavy but familiar on my back, the well-worn trail ahead of me stretching into the endless Vermont wilderness. This was supposed to be my escape, my chance to disconnect from the world. But as the trees closed in, their gnarled branches arching over the path, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't as alone as I thought. The morning had started with my friends, a group of 5, who had accompanied me for the first leg of this trip. We camped together, laughing and sharing stories by the fire, most of them exaggerated tales about mysterious disappearances in these woods. At the time, they were amusing, something to chuckle at in the safety of our circle. By midday, we'd parted ways, and I'd watched them drive off, the sound of their car fading until there was nothing but the rustle of leaves. I hoisted my pack higher, the straps biting into my shoulders as I trudged on. The trail map was old but reliable, marking a campsite just ahead. Yet every bend I rounded revealed more trees, more shadows, and no sign of an opening. It was around the third blind turn that I noticed the quiet, No bird song, no rustle of squirrels, just the crunch of gravel under my boots. The kind of quiet that feels heavy, pressing against your ears. My thoughts turned to the stories my friends had told, about hikers vanishing without a trace, their campsites left untouched, their belongings undisturbed. The first tale was about a hunter, last seen entering the woods in the 1940s. No body, no gear, no explanation, just gone. I'd scoffed at the idea, dismissing it as an accident or a fall. But now, as the trees seemed to close in tighter, the story felt less amusing. A sudden crack behind me made me stop. I froze, turning my head slightly to catch a glimpse over my shoulder. Nothing. Just the trail stretching back into the dense forest. "You're jumping at shadows," I muttered to myself, forcing a shaky laugh. My voice sounded thin, swallowed by the trees. The second story drifted into my mind. A college student, young and carefree, who'd gone hiking alone on a sunny afternoon. Her backpack was found weeks later, resting against a tree, its contents untouched. No sign of her. The thought sent a chill down my spine as I quickened my pace. The trail ahead curved sharply to the left, the ground rising steeply. As I rounded the bend, I stopped short. The trees had tightened, their branches interlocking above me to form a dark tunnel. The sunlight struggled to break through, casting dim, shifting patterns on the ground. My breath hitched as I glanced back again, half expecting to see movement. The trail behind me looked different, wider perhaps, less threatening, but the stillness remained. I'd heard a third story the night before, one that felt uncomfortably close to my current situation. Two hikers had followed a trail that wasn't marked on modern maps, one they claimed had appeared suddenly. They never returned. The idea had seemed laughable then, but now the thought clawed at me, refusing to be ignored. The crunch of gravel under my boots was no longer the only sound. Faint, almost imperceptible, there was another noise, a soft rustling like someone walking just out of sight. I stopped again, my breath shallow, straining to listen. The rustling stopped too. "Hello," I called out, my voice steady but low. The sound seemed to hang in the air, unanswered. I waited, listening, but all I could hear was the pounding of my own heart. "You're imagining things," I muttered to myself. But as I stepped forward, the rustling started again, closer this time. I stopped, turning slowly. "If someone is there, say something," I said, louder now, my grip tightening on the handle of my walking stick. The rustling ceased, but the silence that followed was heavier, almost oppressive. "You need to keep moving," I whispered, as much to myself as to the trees around me. Pushing forward, the trail twisted and turned, the trees a blur as I quickened my pace. Each time my boots crunched the gravel, it felt like an echo. My sound mirrored, or perhaps followed. "You should not have come this way." A voice suddenly broke the silence. It was low, almost a whisper, but unmistakably close. My breath hitched, and I spun around, my eyes darting through the dense trees. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice sharp now. But the forest answered only with stillness. The crunching sound started again, steady and deliberate, coming from somewhere just out of sight. My pulse raced as I tightened my grip on my walking stick. I felt the weight of the stories pressing down on me, their absurdity melting into something far more sinister. The whispers began, soft and overlapping, coming from every direction. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was urgent, insistent. My legs moved before my mind could catch up, breaking into a run as the whispers grew louder, more frantic. The trail twisted endlessly, the branches clawing at me as I raced forward. My pack banged against my back, every step feeling heavier, as if the forest itself was trying to slow me down. And then suddenly I broke through into a clearing. The whispers stopped. The air was lighter here, the sunlight breaking through to reveal an old wooden bench at the center of the clearing. It looked weathered, its surface carved with initials and dates. I approached cautiously, my chest heaving, my legs trembling. As I stood before the bench, one carving caught my eye. It was deep, the letters etched with deliberate force. "Stay away." Beneath it, a date that sent a chill through me. 1943. I turned back toward the trail, half expecting to see the shadows close in again. But the trees looked ordinary, their branches no longer reaching, the path clear and wide. The whispers were gone, but the weight of the silence remained. I pitched my tent that night, the fire burning brightly until dawn. I didn't sleep, the carved words looping endlessly in my mind, and I haven't been back since. Story 6. It started as a festival like any other, a place for music, dancing, and freedom. For me, it was an escape, a chance to leave behind the chaos of everyday life and lose myself in the rhythm and lights. But that year, everything went wrong, and I learned how thin the line is between a dream and a nightmare. I had decided to go solo. The friends I'd gone with the year before weren't in the picture anymore, and though I planned to camp with a few acquaintances, I knew I was essentially on my own. By the time I arrived, the lines to get in were impossibly long. Darkness fell as I struggled to find the people I was meant to camp with. My phone's signal cutting in and out. When I finally set up my small tent, it was already late. The festival grounds were sprawling, unfamiliar, and disorienting in the dark. The first night passed in a blur of music and crowds. I'd taken something to enhance the experience, but it hit me harder than I anticipated. My sense of direction, always poor, became non-existent. When my acquaintances wandered off, I realized too late that I had no idea where my tent was. The paths all looked the same, and the cold of the desert night was seeping into my skin. Wandering aimlessly, I stumbled into a lit-up disco area. The pulsing lights and heavy bass were a strange comfort, pulling me in like a moth to a flame. Amid the dancing crowd, a woman caught my eye. Her outfit was peculiar, almost old-fashioned, like something out of a different era. She smiled, and her presence felt strangely grounding. "You look lost," she said, her voice soft but clear over the music. "I am," I admitted. "I can't find my campsite." "Let's look together," she offered, and I followed her without hesitation. We walked for what felt like hours, though it could have been minutes. The festival's sounds grew distant as we ventured further, and the lights became fewer and farther between. The silence between us felt heavy, the kind that made me uneasy. "Do you come to these often?" I asked, trying to break the tension. She tilted her head slightly. "You could say that. I like the energy, the way people lose themselves here." "It's easy to get lost in more ways than one," I replied, my voice trembling slightly. "Have you ever felt like you don't belong?" Her smile widened, but it didn't reach her eyes. "More than you know." The way she said it made my skin crawl. But before I could ask more, we reached an area where cars and RVs were parked. The glow of lanterns and string lights cast long shadows, and the air felt colder here. A man approached us, his figure backlit by a small lantern. He was in his early 30s, holding glow sticks that cast eerie shadows on his face. "Hey, need some help?" he asked. The woman smiled and reached for one of the glow sticks. "Sure." She slipped it onto her wrist and, without a word, skipped away into the dark. "Wait," I called after her, but she didn't stop. The man turned his attention to me. "You okay? You look cold. Where's your campsite?" "I don't know," I admitted. "I'm trying to find it." "You remind me of my sister," he said, his tone almost too casual. "I wouldn't want her out here like this. Look, my buddy and I are heading back to our RV. Why don't you rest there for a bit? It'll be safer." I hesitated, but his concern seemed genuine. Grateful for the offer, I followed him. The RV was a toy hauler, its back open to reveal a makeshift lounge. He put on an album I used to love as a teenager, its familiarity strangely disarming. He tucked me into a pile of blankets, and I started to drift in and out of consciousness as the music looped. "You seem tired," he said at one point, sitting across from me. "It's easy to get overwhelmed here. Everything feels bigger, louder." I nodded weakly. I didn't think it would be this hard to keep track of everything. It's like everything blends together. He leaned forward, his eyes catching the dim light. "Sometimes the festival isn't about what you see, it's about what finds you." His words made my stomach tighten, but before I could respond, he stood up and walked to the front of the RV. I heard low murmurs, another voice joining his, but I couldn't make out the words. Hours later, I became aware of movement. The man was back, his weight pressing down on me, his hands unwelcome and invasive. Another figure appeared, his friend watching at first, then joining. My protests were weak, my limbs heavy. "We helped you," the man hissed. "You owe us." Something in his voice snapped me out of my haze. Adrenaline surged and I lashed out, my knee connecting with his groin. He yelped, and in the chaos, I scrambled out of the RV. The night air hit me like ice, but I didn't stop. I ran blindly into the desert. the thorny bushes tearing at my skin. Their shouts faded behind me as I pushed further into the darkness, my breath ragged, my heart pounding. Eventually I collapsed, trembling and covered in dirt. A couple stumbled upon me, their kind faces a stark contrast to what I'd just escaped. They stayed with me, offering water and warmth until the first light of dawn crept over the horizon. When I finally found my tent, it was less than 10 yards from where I'd started my desperate search. I packed up and left that morning, vowing never to go to another festival alone. Even now the memory lingers. I don't know who that woman was, whether she was real or a figment of my altered state, but her smile, both inviting and unsettling, haunts my dreams. And the man's words, "You owe us," echo in my mind, a reminder of how quickly freedom can turn to fear. Story 7. The world of hitchhiking is one of unpredictability, a blend of kindness, adventure, and sometimes danger. My love for it had taken me across 7 countries without a single bad experience. But last December in Greece, I learned how quickly trust can be misplaced and how thin the line is between hospitality and menace. It was the morning of December 2nd. I had woken early in my hammock, strung up behind castle ruins, the only spot with trees that didn't belong to someone else. The night had been cold, and the bustling market across the street had jolted me awake. After a quick breakfast, I grabbed my gear and made my way to the roadside with a sign that read, "Athens and Sparta" in Greek. The hours dragged on. Cars zipped by, most heading toward the first exit. It took over an hour before a small, worn-out white car pulled up. The driver, an older man around 60, looked disheveled, with greasy hair, a nose dotted with blackheads and a few missing teeth. He didn't speak much English, but I understood he was going to Sparta. Frustrated by the lack of options, I decided to take the chance and climbed in. We attempted a conversation, but the language barrier made it impossible. He offered me a cigarette, which I declined. His words were fragmented, and I struggled to piece together meaning. "You alone. Why Sparta?" he asked slowly, glancing at me with a curious tilt of his head. "I'm traveling," I replied, trying to keep my tone light. "Just passing through." He nodded, though I wasn't sure he understood. "You like Greece? Beautiful country," he said, gesturing broadly at the mountains around us. "It's amazing," I said, forcing a smile. "The landscapes, the people. Everyone has been so kind." He chuckled, a low, raspy sound. "Yes, kind people. Good people." His eyes lingered on me a second too long before he turned back to the road. We drove for about 6 kilometers before he suddenly turned off the main road. My unease grew as we pulled into a small yard nestled on a mountainside. I glanced around, noting the olive trees and sheep that dotted the property. "Why are we stopping?" I asked, my voice betraying a hint of nervousness. He gestured toward the house. "Eat, rest. You tired, yes? Then Sparta." "I'm okay," I said quickly. "I'd rather keep going." He shook his head. "No. Number come, my house, good food. You eat, then we go." Unsure how to refuse, I followed him to the terrace. He lit another cigarette and motioned for me to sit. Using Google Translate, he typed something and handed me the phone. "Stay tonight. Drive you tomorrow." "I need to get to Sparta today," I typed back, showing him the screen. "It's important." He frowned, typing slowly. His response read, "Too late. No cars. Dangerous." "I'll be fine," I insisted, standing to retrieve my bags. He followed me inside, his presence looming. "Wait," he said, blocking the doorway. "You not safe out there. Better here. Warm here." His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that made my skin crawl. "Thank you, but I really need to leave," as I said, trying to step around him. He didn't move. Instead, he smiled, a slow, unsettling grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Why hurry?" "No one wait for you," he said, his tone almost mocking. I felt a chill run down my spine. "Please move," I said firmly. He didn't budge. Instead, he raised his hand, making a lewd gesture. My stomach dropped. "No," I said sharply, stepping back. His smile faded, replaced by a cold intensity. He grabbed me by the crotch, his grip firm and invasive. My body froze as a cold, tingling sensation swept over me. For a moment, the room felt suffocatingly still. Then instinct took over. I raised my fist, ready to fight. He must have sensed my resolve because he released me, stepping back. "Are we going to be intimate?" he asked, his voice disturbingly calm. "No," I said, my tone sharp and unwavering. The weight of my voice seemed to break whatever spell held him. He unlocked the door and stepped aside. I didn't wait. Clutching my bags, I bolted down the path, past the sleeping dog and out onto the road. My heart pounded as I scanned my surroundings. A group of hunters stood nearby, their shotguns slung over their shoulders. Their presence was a strange comfort, a reminder that I wasn't entirely alone. I walked for what felt like hours, sticking close to the road. When a car finally approached, I held up an empty water bottle, signaling desperation. The second car stopped. The driver, a kind stranger, offered me a ride to Sparta. By the time I reached Athens later that evening, the weight of the encounter still clung to me. Showered, scrubbing away the grime and the memory. The kindness I'd experienced during my travels had made me complacent, too trusting. I still believe in the goodness of people. But that day I learned that trust must be earned. The image of that man's face, his greasy hair and leering smile, haunts me. Hitchhiking will always be an adventure, but it's one I approach now with far greater caution. Story 8. When I was 9, my family, my dad, my sister, my stepmom, and I visited a camping resort called Pine Haven Retreat. It wasn't a traditional island, but was surrounded by dense forests and winding trails. The main paths were accessible only by golf carts or small utility vehicles, and the rest of the area was a thick maze of trees and vegetation. It was the kind of place where, once you stepped off the beaten path, the world seemed to close in around you. It was our second time at Pine Haven, so I felt confident navigating it. That afternoon, we'd been hanging out at one of the recreational areas. I had made a new friend, another boy around my age, and we'd spent hours running around the playground. Eventually, my family left me there to play with my friend, promising to check back later. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, my friend's family decided to leave, and I realized I was alone. I wasn't worried. I knew the campground well enough, or so I thought. After waving goodbye, I started walking back toward our campsite. But as I followed what I thought was the right trail, the trees began to look unfamiliar. Instead of leading me back to the campgrounds, the path opened into a small boat launch by the water. A few people were there, unloading fishing gear and chatting casually. Feeling nervous but trying to appear composed, I approached one of the men. "Excuse me, can you help me? I'm trying to find campsite 18. This wasn't entirely true. Our site was number 12, but I thought giving a number further away might make it harder for anyone to figure out where I really belonged. The man, middle-aged with a scruffy beard, nodded and pointed toward a narrow trail. "Just head that way and keep walking. You'll hit the campsite soon enough." I thanked him and started walking. The air grew cooler as the sun sank lower, and the shadows of the trees stretched long across the ground. I hadn't known it at the time, but my family had already realized I was missing. They had split up into 2 golf carts and were scouring the campground, calling my name. After what felt like an eternity of walking, a car pulled up beside me. It was an older model sedan, dusty and a little worse for wear. The driver, one of the men from the boat launch, rolled down his window. "Hey, kid," he said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "You've been walking a while. Need a ride to your campsite?" I hesitated. My legs were aching, and the idea of sitting down was tempting. He gestured to the passenger seat. "Come on, I'll get you there. It's no trouble." I opened the door slowly and climbed in, clutching my backpack tightly. The car smelled faintly of cigarette smoke and something metallic. As we started driving, the man kept the conversation light. "Where are you from?" "Here with your family?" "Yeah," I replied, trying to sound casual. "We're just here for the weekend." He nodded, glancing at me briefly before returning his eyes to the road. "Nice place, isn't it? Quiet, lots of space to roam." I nodded but said nothing, my unease growing. Then I noticed we had passed the entrance to the campsites. My stomach tightened. I think you missed the turn," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he kept driving, his grip on the steering wheel tightening. After a moment, he glanced at me. "You sure that was the right turn?" he asked, his tone calm but unnervingly measured. "Yes," I said firmly. "That's where the campsites are." He sighed, shaking his head slightly. Don't worry. Kid, I'll get you there. Just sit tight." My heart was pounding now, but I forced myself to stay calm. "I really think we should turn around," I said louder this time. "Relax," he said, his voice taking on an edge. "You're fine." I glanced out the window, searching desperately for something familiar, but the trees blurred past, offering no comfort. My fingers hovered over the door handle, my pulse racing. Then up ahead I saw it, a golf cart coming toward us. Relief washed over me as I recognized my dad behind the wheel. Without thinking, I rolled down the window and started waving frantically. "Dad! Dad!" The car screeched to a halt as my dad pulled the golf cart in front of it, blocking the road. He stepped out, his concealed carry drawn and aimed at the driver. "Let him out!" my dad barked, his voice low and commanding. The man froze, his eyes darting between my dad and me. I fumbled with the manual lock on the door, finally managing to open it. As soon as I was out, I ran to my dad, who kept the gun trained on the driver while dialing the police. "What were you doing with my son?" my dad demanded, his voice cold and steady. The driver stammered, holding his hands up in surrender. "I was just helping him find his campsite," the man said, but his tone lacked conviction. "By driving past the entrance?" my dad shot back, not lowering the gun. "Stay where you are. The cops are on their way." The man didn't argue or resist. He stayed in the car, his hands visible, until the police arrived and took him into custody. Only later did we learn that he and his family had been involved in similar incidents at other campgrounds, though they had always managed to avoid consequences until now. That night, as I lay in my bunk in the camper, I couldn't stop replaying the events in my head. The man's casual demeanor, the way he had steered me away from safety. I try not to dwell on what might have happened if my dad hadn't shown up when he did. Pine Haven Retreat had always seemed like a haven, a place where the world couldn't touch us. But now it felt different. The shadows seemed darker, the quiet more oppressive. I've never forgotten that day. It's a stark reminder of how quickly something innocent can turn dangerous, and how vital it is to trust your instincts. Even now, the thought of that man's face and his silence sends a chill down my spine. Story 9. Several years ago, my friends and I ventured into a remote campsite deep within the Kalahari Reserve of Botswana. The area was infamous for its unrestrained wilderness, where no fences separated humans from the wildlife. Animals roamed freely, and you were always acutely aware that you were a guest in their world. Of all the creatures that frequented the campsite, none were as imposing or feared as the elephants. The rules of camping in this region were clear and strict, with one rule emphasized above all else: never bring citrus fruits. Elephants could smell them from miles away, and their desire to get to them was relentless. Despite the warnings, a neighboring group decided to test fate. It was a couple camping in a rooftop tent who smugly claimed their airtight fridge would conceal the forbidden fruit. That night, the air was still, the kind of oppressive silence that made every rustle of leaves sound louder than it should. My group had already settled in for the night, the low murmur of distant animal calls lulling us to sleep. Sometime past midnight, the tranquility shattered. A deep, resonant rumble, a sound unmistakably from an elephant, echoed through the campsite. I scrambled out of my tent just in time to hear a frantic shout from the couple's campsite. "It's here! Get out! Now!" The husband's voice was thick with panic. Peering into the darkness, I could barely make out the massive shadow of an elephant, its trunk sweeping across the couple's vehicle. Even from a distance, the sheer size of the creature was overwhelming. "What do we do?" one of my friends whispered beside me, his voice trembling. "We stay quiet and watch," I whispered back, though every instinct screamed at me to run. The couple wasn't as cautious. They scrambled down from their rooftop tent just as the elephant's tusks pierced through the canvas. The vehicle groaned under the weight as the elephant ripped the jerry cans off the side, tossing them aside like toys. The fridge was next, and as the elephant smashed it open, the unmistakable scent of oranges filled the air. "It's going to destroy everything," someone muttered nearby. "Why did they even bring oranges?" another voice hissed. "Idiots," a third person said, their tones sharp and angry. "They're going to get us all killed." I glanced at my friend who was clutching a flashlight tightly. "We should help. Maybe honk the car horn or something?" "You really want to draw attention to us?" he shot back, his voice low and taut. "Just stay still." Meanwhile, the elephant's rage seemed to intensify with every passing second. Other campers began honking car horns, revving engines, and flashing headlights to scare it off. But the elephant was unfazed. The air cannon blasts finally broke through the chaos, their deafening booms startling the massive creature. The women and children, following protocol, ran to the reinforced bathrooms surrounded by thick elephant-proof walls. The husband shouted over the noise, Get to the bathroom. We'll be safe there. But his wife clung to him, shaking her head. I'm not leaving you. Go, just go, he urged, pushing her toward the path. She hesitated for a moment before running, her sobs audible even over the commotion. It's still not leaving, my friend said, his eyes glued to the rampaging elephant. Why isn't it leaving? Because it got what it wanted, I said, pointing toward the smashed fridge. The elephant had managed to extract the fruit, crushing it beneath its massive feet as it gobbled up the pieces. Finally, the elephant let out a bellowing roar and retreated into the darkness, leaving behind a trail of destruction. The couple, visibly shaken, packed what was left of their belongings the next morning and left without a word. But that wasn't the only incident that trip. On our last evening, as the fire's glow flickered against the night, we heard whispers of another cautionary tale from some seasoned campers. Never, under any circumstances, leave your vehicle if it gets stuck, one of them said, his face lit eerily by the firelight. You stay inside. You wait for help. Always. Why? Someone asked. The camper leaned forward, his tone grim. Because this isn't a zoo. Out here, you're prey. Lions, hyenas, leopards. They're always watching. Waiting. Has it really happened? A younger camper asked, his voice barely audible. The older man nodded slowly. Happens more than you think. Last year, there was a pair of campers who thought they'd be fine. Their car got stuck in the sand, and instead of waiting, they decided to walk the rest of the way back to camp. They never made it. What happened to them? Another voice asked, trembling. The man stared into the flames. Their car was found the next day, empty. No signs of struggle, no tracks leading away. Just gone. The campsite grew quiet as the story settled over us. The weight of the wilderness suddenly more tangible. That night, as I lay in my tent, every sound, the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, felt amplified, a reminder of the unseen eyes that watch from the shadows. In places like the Kalahari, the rules aren't mere suggestions, they're lifelines, and those who disregard them often become stories told around campfires, warnings for those who come after. Storyteller. My girlfriend and I decided to go camping to celebrate our anniversary last summer. Since we were on a tight budget, we chose a campsite we found on a website where people rent out spaces on their private land. The place we booked was in Pine Ridge, Colorado, and all the reviews we read were glowing. It seemed like the perfect choice. A few days before our trip, the host texted me detailed directions, warning that cell service would cut out as we got closer to the site. On the way there, I called to ask about check-in, and she explained there was no formal process. We'd simply drive straight to our designated spot. Everything felt normal, even welcoming. When we arrived, a large swinging gate marked the entrance, decorated with colorful flags. Using the code the host provided, we let ourselves in and followed the winding dirt road uphill. Along the way, we passed a few other campers, a couple of families, children playing near their tents, and an older man with an Airstream parked near the base of the hill. Our site was at the very top, with a stunning view of the forest stretching out in every direction. It had been raining on and off all day, so we quickly set up our tent before another downpour hit. We spent the afternoon exploring the nearby trails, reading and enjoying the quiet. By the time we lit a fire and settled in for the evening, the sky had cleared, and the forest felt alive with nocturnal sounds. Around 11 p.m., just as we were getting ready for bed, we heard it. A deep, mechanical hum, like a jet engine starting up, but muffled and distant. It came from somewhere in the forest, about 200 feet away. My girlfriend and I froze, exchanging a glance. Did you hear that? She asked hesitantly. Yeah, I replied, straining to listen. What do you think it is? She shrugged, her face uneasy. Maybe a generator? Someone else's camp? I nodded, though the explanation didn't sit right. Strangely, neither of us pressed the issue further. We simply went to bed, dismissing the noise as part of the unfamiliar surroundings. The next morning, the air was crisp, and we made breakfast while discussing our plans for the day. Maybe we could find that scenic drive you were talking about, my girlfriend suggested, sipping her coffee. I agreed, but as I started packing our day bag, the sky darkened and a torrential rain began to fall. Of course, I muttered, grabbing the tarp to cover our gear. As we scrambled to secure everything, the same strange hum echoed through the forest. This time, it was louder. My girlfriend and I turned to each other, wide-eyed. There it is again, she said, her voice trembling. What the hell is that? I shook my head, trying to stay calm. I don't know, but it's definitely closer. The noise sent a chill down my spine, and I felt a wave of anxiety building. Despite years of managing my anxiety disorder, something about that moment tipped me over the edge. I had a full-blown panic attack, convinced we needed to leave the campsite and drive into town to check the weather. "We have to go," I said, my voice shaking. I need to know what's going on." My girlfriend, always patient, agreed. "Okay, let's go," she said softly, grabbing her jacket. "We'll figure it out." The drive into town took nearly an hour, the route dotted with scattered farmhouses and two massive churches painted in oddly vibrant colors. Their presence felt unsettling, though I couldn't explain why. "Those churches are so out of place," my girlfriend murmured, her eyes fixed on the buildings as we passed. "I know," I said, gripping the steering wheel tighter. "Something about them feels off." Once we reached town, we checked the forecast, which reassured us the rain would stop for the rest of the day. We grabbed a snack, picked up some supplies, and headed back to the campsite. When we returned, the first thing we noticed was that all the other campers were gone. No tents, no vehicles, not even a scrap of trash remained. The site was eerily pristine, as if no one had ever been there. My girlfriend and I exchanged uneasy glances. "Where did everyone go?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head. "I don't know. Maybe they left because of the rain." My words sounded hollow, even to me. We settled in, trying to reclaim the sense of peace we'd felt the day before. As I prepared dinner, the hum returned, louder and more persistent. My girlfriend and I stared at each other, wide-eyed. "What is that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know," I admitted, my chest tightening, "but it's definitely closer." A half hour later, my girlfriend started feeling unwell. She had a chronic pain condition that sometimes flared up at night, so I helped her take her medication and assured her I'd clean up quickly so we could rest. But as I packed up outside, something strange happened. My vision blurred, and everything around me seemed to shimmer with faint pink and green hues. The trees appeared to sway unnaturally, even though the air was still. I dismissed it as exhaustion and went inside the tent. My girlfriend sat frozen, her face pale. "I saw it too," she said, her voice barely audible. "The colors, the movement. Something's wrong. Do you want to leave?" I asked, already knowing her answer. She nodded, and we began tearing down our campsite in a frenzy. The sun was setting, casting long, eerie shadows across the hilltop. As we worked, the oppressive feeling of being watched grew stronger. "Hurry," I urged, my voice tight with fear. "I'm trying," she snapped, her hands fumbling with the tent poles. "I just want to get out of here." Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent shivers down my spine. By the time we finished, the forest was completely dark. We threw everything into the car haphazardly and sped down the hill. Neither of us spoke until we reached the main road. Even then, the tension lingered, unspoken but heavy. We made it back to the city around midnight, exhausted and shaken. In the days that followed, we scoured the internet for explanations. Could it have been infrasound from a natural phenomenon? Some kind of experimental aircraft? Or something else entirely? To this day, we've never found an answer. But whenever I think of that campsite, I'm haunted by the memory of the hum, the colors, and the overwhelming sense that we were not alone.